Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, in our ongoing study in Joseph Butler and the analogy of religion. And we have a great lesson. We're going to take a look at pages 62 to 82. And we're going to take a look at the notion of forming the mature constitution of mind. How do we form the mature constitution of mind? That's key for Butler. And let's begin by taking a look at block 1. We're going to take a look at moral discipline behind the schema of uniformity. We'll begin with note 1. The teaching of religion places us in the state of probation. And we also take up hope for a secure future state. Self possesses the capacities for the future, which means temporal maturity and religious virtue, and these capacities converge in the self's state of discipline. So the state of discipline allows for the enlargement of our faculties. Existing in this state of discipline encourages us to enlarge our faculties toward the moral. So we take a look at the enlargement of faculties in note 2. It takes place through experience and through habit. The internalization of momentary impressions bring about the power of habit. It will create an alteration of character, and it begins first with gnosis. Gnosis is acquired through apprehension and reason, and then memory is actualized. Recollection becomes that which informs the self's positive action. So we tend to develop habits of the mind for moral conduct. It takes place through the formation of inward practical principles, and we become attentive toward this moral imperative, and self-government and practical phronesis is taken up. We want our theoretical schema to become practical in our posited action. We want our theoretical schema to become practical and to be practically applied in reality through positing a moral action. So if you take a look at note 3, developing habits of mind and moral conduct, we've formed the inward practical principles, phronesis in other words, and we do take up this attitude of responsible self-government in positing our actions. So our summary in note 4 looks like this. There are capacities for future state that exist within the self, and they are the striving for secular maturity and striving for religious virtue. Under discipline, the capacities work to inform the self's state of discipline, and the enlargement of faculties takes place through memory and habit, and the steps are 6. There's observation and apprehension of the eidos ideas. There's reflection and the positing of a gnosis. There's a storage of gnosis in memory. Then there's the passive association of ideas through recollection, which allows us to form a theoretical schema model. So the 6 steps reach that point of forming a theoretical schema model. That's got to become practical in order to become a moral act. The theoretical schema has to become practical in order to empower our practical moral act. So let's move on to block 2 and take a look at improving the depth of character through the process of knowing. And that's really what we're being told here, that through this process of knowing and developing that theoretical schema and then positing that in a practical way, we do improve the depth of character. After the enlargement of faculties through the 6 steps we just discussed, the self posits a practical act of virtue. This practical positing is informed by the self's motivational base. Emotive force is strengthened through recollection of admonitions, recollection of experience, and recollection of examples. Our intentionality here should be labeled our endeavor to enforce the virtue which we hold subjectively. We want to posit it and make it an actuality. It's an endeavor to enforce and an endeavor to actualize virtue through practical positing, through praxis. So note too, the praxis as the endeavor to enforce virtue. We do have the means that are acquired for the positing of our act of virtue. We take up readiness and we anticipate a future return. The 6-step chain of knowing is coordinated with glimpses of tendency and reality. So what we hold subjectively in that theoretical schema is coordinated with identifying entrance nodes of tendency in objective reality. That coordination of schema with objective tendency takes place. The self acts out of a state of discipline and participates in what Butler calls the dispensation of providence. So praxis is participation in dispensation of providence. Therefore, look at Note 3, Block 2, Note 3, the process of positing and return creates moral habit. We posit the theoretical schema in a practical way, and then there's a return that comes out of that we internalize to create moral habit. Posited resolution, the moral act, is a posited resolution shaped into a practical sense of virtue based on our motivation. 2, we seek to enforce the ideas we have internalized by coordinating our schema model with glimpses of tendency in reality. 3, the praxis of the act of virtue takes place with an anticipation of return that will inform our motivational base. And then 4, eventually we can form virtuous act sequences that can be recalled whenever tendencies in reality are encountered. In other words, we have an aptitude for forming moral habits. We have an aptitude for forming moral habits through this process, which is theoretical and practical and return. It's a theoretical schema, it's a practical positing of praxis, and it's a return out of praxis to increase moral aptitude and develop moral habit. So if you look at note block 3, the enlargement of faculties and the posited resolution lead to moral improvement, moral enhancement. We begin with natural affections. Habits of virtue combat deviation from the right. The self also will enlist moral understanding. The natural affections are always to be subject to the moral principle that we hold and that we develop. 2, we take a look at hupomeno enduring. The self's fallen nature leaves it inclined toward unlawful means to satisfy affections, but the self must recollect and recall the principle of virtue. Then the self will strengthen this principle through the retained impressions that we've received through our action of positing return. We give attentiveness to the impressions of right, and unlawful affection is overruled by a transition to a final moral interest. We transition to a final moral interest. So if you look at note 3, taking up the practice of moral strengthening through discipline results in habits of virtue. These are abbreviated under the notion of self-government. Improvement in self-government results in advancement in moral happiness. So this advancement takes place through egairo, raising up. we become raised up to a state of virtue. We are also subjectively endowed with inclinations toward discipline and moral understanding that allows us to reach that theoretical schema. So we reach that speculative perception for positing, and we have the transition to the phronesis of practical sense, and our goal is the improved constitution of mind, says Butler. The goal of this process is improved constitution of mind. Through education and discipline, we improve our constitution of mind. So this process of enlargement of our moral capacity through the 6-step process, then the positing of a theoretical resolution in a practical way, all of that is to serve moral improvement of the constitution of mind. And we want to take a look at that constitution of mind in column 4, give it some more attention, but before we do that, let's take a look at our little summary triad now at the top of column 4. Because what we've learned is that we begin to be improved in the constitution of mind. We begin with the enlargement of faculties through gnosis, association, and theoretical schema. We take up the gnosis of discovery of truth, association of ideas, and then we form a systematic theoretical schema of that which is virtuous, of providence. 2, we posit this schema in a practical phronesis. So we do move on to phronesis and praxis of action and reflection. Those together, the enlargement of faculty and the positing of a theoretical schema in a practical way, creates an improved constitution of mind through our understanding, through our speculative positing. We shape and improve the moral mind. So that's our recall triad, but let's take a look at the details in column 4. And Butler says we begin with nous, mind, and temptation. Constitution of mind confronts a vicious world, and we end up establishing the self in a state of moderation. The constitution of nature admits the possibility of the loss of innocence. That is a continual battle with our speculative knowledge and our speculative schema model positing. Moral attentiveness is necessary to strengthen speculative knowledge and the schema model. The snares of temptation make up one side of our state of discipline. So we are tempted to deviate from the work of developing our schema model. Now take a look at 2, we take a look at nous, mind, and the posited resolution. It takes up 3 attributes: recollection, the intent of the mind, and self-government of virtue. Self also takes up a tendency to form habits of virtue. The self will then exercise the principle of virtue that is held in our motivational state, and in our long-term memory, we exercise the principle of virtue. That takes us on to 3, nous, mind, and praxis, the practical action. Through continued recollection, the self is empowered for praxis, and praxis creates the habits of virtue. The state of mind is especially fit to enclose a state of discipline, and to attain this state of discipline is to fulfill providential design, says Butler. Our course of obedience will form moral habits of veracity, of justice, and of charity. But again, just in closing, go to that top of column 4. We have a great overview of really Butler's entire system. He's positing a system of the self enlarging the faculties for moral good through gnosis, through association, and through forming a theoretical schema model of providence. Then we move on to the practical. We posit a resolution. Schema becomes phronesis and praxis. That leads to the constitution of improving our moral mind, the constitution of mind. Through understanding, through speculative positing, we shape the moral mind. Just unbelievably great teaching from Butler here. And I think these 20 pages really give us a great encapsulated look at his general position on natural religion, how it involves that depth of growth of our faculties for the moral good, and then how we develop a schema, a theoretical model of the divine providence, but it has to become practical, just like the Apostle Paul. It can't remain in the theoretical, it has to become practical. It must be posited as what he calls a posited resolution. He calls it a posited resolution. Well, that is a practical resolution, so it is phronesis and praxis, but he calls it a posited resolution. So we posit the resolution of virtue, a very practical aspect of our theoretical schema. And that builds up habits of virtue, and it builds up the constitution of mind toward the goal of the design of providence. So that gives us a great lesson and a great recall triad there at the top of column 4. We'll pick up next time on page 83.